As the U.S. and Cuba have moved slightly closer together over the past week, two of the likely 2016 GOP presidential contenders have become quite a bit more distant. Here at TYT, we like to call that a catfight. The cats in this case are Rand Paul and Marco Rubio, feuding over whether Obama and the State Department have done well in terms of the agreement that they reached with Cuba. So this started off with Senator Rand Paul expressing support for the deal, for the modification at least to the embargo. Here is a clip of that.
You know, the 50-year embargo with Cuba just hadn't worked. I mean, if the goal was regime change, it sure doesn't seem to be working. And probably it punishes the people more than the regime, because the regime can blame the embargo for hardship. And if there's open trade, I think the people will see what it's like to all the things that we produce under capitalism. So in the end, I think probably opening up Cuba is a good idea.
Yes, those things we produce, like iPods and M&Ms and inequality, they need access to those things as well. So he expressed support, as we showed you right there. Very quickly, Marco Rubio responded, and he was pretty rough with his criticism of the senator.
Senator, your thoughts on Senator Rand Paul's comments supporting the president?
Well, like many people that have been opining, he has no idea what he's talking about, and I'll tell you why. Number one, the embargo on Cuba is an embargo that, quite frankly, has a bunch of holes in it. To give you an example, Cuba, the United States, is still one of Cuba's largest trading partners, even now with the embargo. All sorts of commercial products and humanitarian products like foodstuffs and other things are available in Cuba. Americans travel there all the time on what they call cultural exchanges. A bunch of Americans travel there, by the way, in violation of the embargo through third countries. Cuban Americans can travel as many times as they want. They can send a lot of money back to Cuba to their relatives. What's hurting the Cuban people is not the embargo. What's hurting the Cuban people is the Cuban government.
A lot wrong with what he just said there. So his point was that the embargo isn't working, but it would be working if we did a tougher embargoes. That's actually what Marco Rubio would like. So I guess you don't want those people to get the money. You don't want people in his district, in fact, to go ahead and send money back to their families. But he can't quite say that. So he backed off of it at the last second, because it's an insane thing to be saying.
Every time somebody makes an excuse for why their ideology didn't work, it's always, well, we didn't do it perfectly.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And like communism, that wasn't really communism. If we'd done communism right, then right now we'd all be living under the Soviet Union and be awesome. Okay, maybe yes, maybe no. Largely no. So if we'd done the embargo right, you know that this is the same thing they're going to say when the war on drugs is finally over. But we didn't do the war on drugs right. If we had just executed everybody who'd ever smoked pot, then we would have won the war on drugs.
Well, it's like abstinence-only education. If you just teach it right, then humans will no longer have the biological desire to have sex with people.
Right.
We haven't done it right.
Right. It's funny, we're joking about some of this stuff, but like there are people with the death penalty. We administer it far less frequently here in the United States, although we've still killed 35 people this year. But there are definitely those who think, and I take this because when Cenk was in favor of the death penalty, you were in favor of this. Yeah, get it done quick and publicly, then it would be working.
That's right.
like they do in Saudi Arabia and Iran. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And make it stick.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if you've noticed, there are no more murders in Saudi Arabia or Iran.
Right, yeah, totally.
Yeah, no thievery either. They just had to take off one hand. So that was the first of Marco Rubio's little clips there, but there are more. He expands on why he thinks that growing closer to Cuba would not be a good thing for America.
Look, Venezuela's economy looks like Cuba's economy now. You can't even buy toilet paper in Caracas. And there's no embargo on Venezuela. What Venezuela has in common with Cuba is they both have adopted radical socialist governmental policies. And I would expect that people would understand that. If they just took a moment to analyze that, they would realize that the embargo is not what's hurting the Cuban people. It's the lack of freedom and the lack of competent leaders.
So should we have an embargo on Venezuela? What's he?
Yeah,
what is his point?
Yeah, that's the thing I can't quite discern, because, then if the government is what's hurting the Cuban people, which, by the way, we agree with, we think the Castro government is certainly hurting the Cuban people, right? Okay, but the question is, what do we do about it, Marco? That's
the same
what we're
thing
trying
we've
to figure
been doing
out.
for half a century.
Right. So,
and obviously, Megyn Kelly thought that same thing, and then asked this very tough follow-up.
I know you say you don't care what the polls show, but if it's so bad, why do so many people support it? Why do we see cheering in the streets in Cuba today?
Well, a couple of points. On the Cuba front, I think the people of Cuba are so desperate, they're hoping anything is a better news than what they have today. They want this to work. So do I. I wish I was wrong, Megyn. I wish that, in fact, this economic opening would lead to democracy. But here's my second and final point. We have a poll every 2 years in Florida. It's called elections. Every member of Congress in South Florida is for the embargo. They have elected. We had a governor's race where Rick Scott, who was for the embargo, defeated Charlie Crist, who was against it. I was elected to the U.S. Senate on this platform. My predecessor was elected on this platform. That's a poll that takes place every 2 years at the ballot box.
Yeah, and so a couple of congressmen down in Florida should determine our foreign policy towards one of our closest neighbors.
Yeah, I think
it doesn't make any sense.
Let's let Congress, the delegation from Florida, decide why stop at Cuba.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we handle North Korea? Let's get Ileana Ross-Leighton in on that. Find out. Bob Martinez should take chair. I mean, it's nuts. By the way, I was kidding. I thought, because of course she didn't ask a tough follow-up, because that question is just sitting there for a guy who says, look, the embargo doesn't work, so let's double down on the embargo. But of course she didn't ask that question, but then it turns out we did have another clip, so we aired that. But that was an interesting thing. She did at least ask. They seem pretty pleased in Cuba. You keep talking about how terrible it is for the Cuban people. And
also among Cuban Americans, what he's defensive about is that polling now indicates that even Cuban Americans say lift the embargo.
So some of the results that have come back, 68% of respondents favor restoring diplomatic relations with Cuba. And these are, by the way, all Cuban Americans being polled here. Among specifically younger respondents, 90% of respondents favor restoring diplomatic ties. And a large majority, over 70%, responded that the U.S. embargo of Cuba has not worked at all or has not worked very well.
Remember,
those are just Cubans, the people that he says are totally in favor of what he's. We don't even exactly know what he's saying.
I'm just guessing, but if George W. Bush had done this, a few years ago, he would have been completely in favor for it. Like 100%.
No.
Why? Because the embargo hasn't worked for years. Everyone knows it hasn't worked for years. What you have in Miami is you have a certain group of the original Cubans that came over, who were mainly, in a lot of cases, the wealthy.
Who lost their stuff.
Who lost their stuff, and they're pissed off. They want to be vindictive about it, versus other people who came later and they want to maybe...
Or even their children and grandchildren who, growing up under their direct control, them telling the younger generations exactly what they should think about Cuba, they can't even get those people to support the same policy.
Yeah. No, those guys, the Cuban Americans, honestly, that you're alluding to, the old school guys, the ones who had their pocket picked by Castro, they're never going to let it go. And
even Bush did.
And by the way, their pockets weren't completely picked. I mean, I went to college with some people from, the regime there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they took out some. Yes, of course. I mean, they came. Yeah, of course. But nonetheless, I mean, they were in charge of Cuba, and they lost that power, right? And so, no, under Bush, under anyone, there's no way. Those guys are so deeply entrenched that they would never back away from this position. We could have the embargo for 154 years and have it not work, and they still would. It could be Castro's great-granddaughter running Cuba, and they'd still be like, give us just one more year.
And Cenk's talking about really the power that they wield through the Cuban American National Foundation, the awkwardly named CAMF. And they're intractable, and what Marco Rubio is talking about, and they wield tremendous political clout still in South Florida, though, as we're seeing from these polls, obviously it's going to be less and less, and that he can say these people were all elected on this platform, but even in South Florida, from the time that we were there in 1998, they don't talk about it nearly as much. It is not the pressing issue it was. It got revitalized by Elian, but and the younger Cubans, they really are baffled by it, and they just think it's their old.
Not to mention non-Cubans,
which is what those polls show,
who overwhelmingly don't even understand why this is an issue that's being debated for the most part.
So, two last things there. Some of the old guard is literally dying off, right? And so, I mean, look at how old Fidel Castro is, let alone Raul. And the guys who used to fight with them are about their age, and a lot of them are dying off. So, some of that opposition is wearing down because of that. But here's something you really have to understand why we've had the embargo for 54 years and why almost all the Cuban American politicians are both in office and still supportive of the embargo, even though almost no one else is. It's the money, Lebowski.
Yeah, right.
So the old school guys who we've been talking about here, Cuban Americans, Wes is right, they still had a lot of money, not all the money that they had, but a lot of money. and they spend that on politics.
Yeah, the Cuban American National Foundation is as powerful a lobby as there is in South Florida by far, and the AARP is in South Florida.
Yeah, and so if you even if the 70% of Cuban Americans roughly are against the embargo at this point, you know how politics works. Who cares? 70%, it could be 90%, it could be 95%, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The guys giving the money are the ones that control the policy, and the ones giving the money are almost all exclusively in favor of the embargo. That's why their guys win, and that's why their guys will never change their position, because it isn't about ideas or things that work, it's about paychecks.
But as you've said, they are dying off, and eventually that money will be bequeathed to people who don't agree politically with that stance.
I just want to point out, I think I'm the only member of the panel who may or may not have broken that embargo and visited Cuba. I'm not saying I did. I'm just saying I might have. I might have taken a flight to Mexico and flown to Mexico from Cuba. And it's amazing when you get there because you realize this is all.
If you'd been there.
If I'd been there, what I would have thought is, this is nuts. Like, because you know who's there? Tons of them. Canadians. They're everywhere because they can go. You can fly from Toronto to Havana and they want to go. And you're like, that person's speaking English. It's amazing. Right? It's not some crazy forbidden. And to say nothing of tons of Europeans. Like, people go there. It's just us. It's not like there is an international effort to isolate this country because nobody thinks that's a wise thing to do.
Yeah.
Nobody really cares. They're not a state sponsor of terrorism. They're not particularly oppressive if you're going to list. I'm sure the dissidents who are locked up feel they're pretty oppressive. But in the grand scheme of your listing oppressive countries, they don't rank that high. You can do a lot worse. And so there are Americans there. I mean, there are Americans there who sail in all the time. There are people who did what I might have done and gone through another country. And then it's like silly. You can't walk down the streets of Havana without tripping over a Canadian family.
Yeah. And not to mention the fact that, of course, the changes that have been described so far don't fundamentally change the relationship all that significantly. You still will not be able to openly conduct tourism from America and things like that. But really fast, so you pointed out that Megyn Kelly did not have harsh follow-up questions for Marco Rubio. Rand Paul did. As we said, this is a cat fight. It has to go back and forth. They batted around with their paws. Rand Paul says, hey, Marco Rubio, if the embargo doesn't hurt Cuba, why do you want to keep it? Many retweets there. Senator Marco Rubio is acting like an isolationist who wants to retreat to our borders and perhaps build a moat. I reject this isolationism.
Let's pause on that just for 1 sec, because that's a seriously aggressive
Yes.
tweet at another senator. Like, I mean, to say nothing, another senator in your own party.
Moat.
Yeah, like you want to build a moat. That's like,
Yeah, and there's already water separating us.
You
by
can
the way.
read, seems to me, Senator Rubio is acting like an isolationist who wants to retreat to our borders and perhaps build a moat, Dick. Like, that's inferred.
It's inferred. The dick is inferred.
Yeah.
So, yes, it's super harsh. Everybody, welcome to the 2016 election. It has begun.
Yes.